Imager's Challenge, the second book of the Imager Portfolio, by L.E. Modesitt, Jr., narrated by William Dufris. Copyright 2009 by L.E. Modesitt, Jr. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with L.E. Modesitt, Jr., and was produced in the year 2009 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Honor is all too often an excuse to abuse power. Belief does not make an image, but can destroy one. The philosophers assume that the rules of the world do not change. That is a false truth. What is unseen cannot be separated from what one images. Do not trust those who will not follow their own tenets. Guilt cannot be imaged, but it can destroy an imager. The thought is the deed. 1. On Vendredi, the 20th of Ernestine, just before the bells rang out the 7th glass of the morning, I hurried across the quadrangle of the Collegium to the administration building to meet with Master de Charton, Imager Maître d'Esprit, the director of all security operations for the Imagers of Solidar, the second most senior imager of the Collegium Imago, and my immediate superior. The faint mist that had hovered above the grass earlier had lifted, and the morning was cooler than usual, perhaps foreshadowing the end of harvest and the coming chill of fall. Both moons were high in the morning sky, with Artiema full and Arion waning, although they were easy to miss in the white sunlight angling over L'Excelsis, sunlight that tended to turn the granite buildings of Imagile a whitish gray. As I reached the open door to Master de Charton's first-floor study, the first bell rang out from the tower of Anomen Imagile. "Come in, Rhenn." I entered the small room with its single desk and bookcase, and but 2 chairs. Master de Charton stood beside the narrow window with its louvered leaded glass panes cranked full open. He turned and nodded for me to close the door. His dark brown hair was shot with gray, more than even a few months before, it seemed to me, but the circles under his eyes did not seem quite so dark, and his narrow face was not quite so haggard. A faint smile rested on his lips. I closed the door, but did not sit. "How are you feeling, Rhenn?" "Most of the soreness in my ribs is gone, and Master Drafford feels that I'm ready. He did suggest that I wear the rib brace for another 2 weeks as a precautionary measure." "Given your tendencies, that's doubtless wise." He gestured toward the writing desk, on which rested a silver pin, the 4-pointed star of the Collegium, encircled by a thin band of silver. "You've seen those, haven't you?" "Only on Master Poincaré, sir. I wondered if he wore it because he was the head of the Collegium." Master de Charton shook his head. "You know we don't wear images of rank, not precisely. The pin merely signifies that you are a master imager, but not what class of master. We found that it reduces misunderstandings for those imagers who have to work outside the Collegium. You wouldn't be wearing it except for your assignment as Collegium liaison to the Civic Patrol of L'Excelsis." He paused. "Go on. Put it on." I picked up the pin and fastened it onto my gray waistcoat, the same cut and style as worn by all imagers, at the same spot where Master Poincaré had worn his, just below the point of the left collar of my pale gray shirt. "Good. That's where it belongs. Now, take it off. You only wear it while you're away from the Collegium, and on duty with the patrol, or going to or returning from such duty." "Yes, sir." "You'll report to Commander Artois at 8th glass on Lundi. After that, I imagine you'll have to be there at 7th glass. Do you know where the patrol headquarters are?" "They're a block or so up Fetter from East River Road, aren't they?" "That's right. Now," Master de Charton fingered his clean-shaven chin, not that any imager was bearded, as he often did when he was considering how to word something precisely. "Commander Artois is a solid, sometimes brilliant man. He doesn't like the Collegium. but he does like imagers like you, too brave for your own good. He knows that you've taken out the Ferran and 3 other assassins." Master de Charton smiled wryly. "He also doesn't like facts being kept from him, but he's not terribly fond of surmises or other ideas that aren't backed with solid evidence. This could present a certain problem for you." I could see that, because I often felt how things might go, long before I could prove it. While I was usually right, I certainly wasn't infallible, and that could prove difficult. "Oh, you might be interested to know that while you were recovering, the First Minister of Ferran recalled their delegation to Ferran for consultations, and a proper period of mourning for the death of Envoy Villar." "Did Master Poincaré have to suggest anything?" I wanted to know if the head of the Collegium had been required to use the threat of revealing that Villar had been a renegade imager. "Apparently not." There was a glint in Master de Charton's eyes before he added, "The letter of sympathy for the unfortunate accident did mention that Master Poincaré also sent his regrets for the loss of such an able envoy with talents that were far beyond his portfolio. That was sufficient, it appears." I nodded. "From time to time you will continue to meet with Maitre Diana, Rhenn. Your skills in indirection may be adequate for the Civic Patrollers, but they leave something to be desired for someone who will need to deal with high holders in the future." That was a veiled reminder and reprimand all in one. "Yes, sir." "Now, so far as your new duties go, you've studied the procedures manual of the Civic Patrol closely, but remember that events on the street seldom accommodate themselves to written procedures. I'm certain that you've considered this, but wherever possible, let the patrollers have the credit for what happens. If matters go badly and it is your fault, take the blame. Take all of it. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." What that meant was that matters had better not go badly where I was involved. "Do you have any questions?" "No, sir." I didn't know enough about my new duties to have questions, and as in so many events of the past year, I had the feeling that by the time I knew enough to ask questions, it would be too late. "Unless you run into extreme difficulties, I'll see you here next jeudi evening at 5:30. "Next jeudi at 5:30. He nodded, and I inclined my head in return, then opened the door to the small study, a chamber most modest for the second most powerful imager in Solidar, and perhaps in the entire world of Terranar. As I walked across the quadrangle to return to my quarters and to continue my studies of the procedures manual of the Civic Patrol, I couldn't help but wonder over the circumstances that had brought me from a journeyman portraiteurist to an imager maitre d'aspect. While I certainly hadn't planned on being an imager, I knew that being an imager was far more palatable to my father than being an artist had been. As an imager, even as a low-level master, I had status, even a hint of power, and that was something my father, the wolf actor, could appreciate. And now that I had a beautiful and acceptable young woman in Celiora, despite her Farsi background, interested in me, my mother was hopeful that a marriage would be in the offing. There were a few problems with being an imager that they did tend to gloss over, such as my having been wounded twice in the past year, and others that I hadn't mentioned in any detail to them, such as my unresolved difficulties with High Holder Rhenn, who was absolutely certain, sooner or later, to try to destroy me in some fashion or another, or the fact that Celiora's family, while certainly wealthy, still possessed certain connections that were highly useful, but not necessarily totally legal. 2. Although Samedi was the first day of the weekend for most people in L'Excelsis, for me the weekend didn't begin until almost noon, at the earliest. I still had to rise just before dawn and hurry down to the exercise chambers. Because of the bruises and other injuries I had suffered in dealing with the Ferran spy and his assassins after the Council's harvest ball, I couldn't do a number of the exercises, and my running was far slower than it had been. After the 4-mile run, I just stood there on the west side of the quadrangle, catching my breath, panting and sweating. My ribs ached, but not so badly as they had almost 3 weeks earlier. Cloville stepped over to me. "Not too bad for a cripple." Even though he was an imager tertius, he was in charge of conditioning and training for all imagers in the covert branch of the Collegium, and he knew exactly how much to press me. "You're improving." Not too bad at all, considering I'd only been able to run for the past week or so. But then I'd been in good shape before the explosion that had thrown me into the stone wall surrounding the council chateau, and my shields had taken the brunt of the impact, although Master Drafford had pointed out that was also why I had been bruised all over, because they had distributed the impact as much as cushioning it. "We'll wait another few weeks before you get more training in hand-to-hand combat," he added. "Master DeCharton thinks you'll need it sooner or later." I just nodded. My suspicions were that Master DeCharton felt I needed it more to keep me humble than for any other reason, but he'd been right most of the time. I just had to remember what Celiora's Farsi grandmother had said, that while Master DeCharton and the Collegium were not my enemies, neither were they my friends. The Collegium looked out for the best interests of imagers as a whole, not for individual imagers, and individuals often paid the price. That was why Clouston, one of the friendliest imagers I'd known, had died in Canaan, the only reminder a stone plaque bearing his name on the memorial wall adjoining the dining hall. I didn't even know how or why he had died. "I'll let you know," Cloville added before turning away and addressing D'Artagnan. "You're slowing down there." "Late night last night, sir." D'Artagnan smiled apologetically. I couldn't help grinning as I walked back toward my quarters in the building that housed single imagers tertius and a few single junior masters like me. After showering and shaving, I dressed and headed for the dining hall. Once there, I still felt strange taking a seat at the master's table, the smaller table at one end of the hall, set perpendicular to the 2 long tables, one for imagers primus, and the other for imagers secundus and tertius. My lack of ease came from the fact that I'd only been a master for a little over 2 weeks, and I was by far the youngest at the table. Ferran was the only master who was close to my age, the only officially revealed master at least, because some of the field and covert operatives, such as Baraton, who headed security at the council chateau, held the hidden rank and pay of maitre d'aspect. I sat next to Ferran, and we were joined by Isola, who, although technically a tertius, was granted master privileges as the chorister of the Nameless at the Anomen Dimagile. "Good morning, Rhenn, Ferran." "Good morning," I replied. Isola was always cheerful, and while we were generally expected to attend services on Soleil evening, for me that had been no real problem, because her homilies were usually so good that it didn't bother me that I wasn't even sure whether I believed in the Nameless. "Did either of you see Veritone this morning?" asked Ferran. "I'm part of Cloville's morning torture group. I usually don't get a chance to pick up the news sheets until after breakfast. What's happened now?" "The oligarch of Jariola claims that the Ferrans are massing forces on the border next to the coal mines, and Chief Councillor Surian has sent a communique to Ferial suggesting that Solidar regards that as a hostile and provocative act." "Is our southern fleet heading north from Canaan and Tiempre?" asked Isola, as she passed the flatcakes and berry syrup to me. "There's nothing in either Tablata or Veritone," Ferran replied. "The first speaker of Tiempre issued another warning about our trade agreement with Canaan, though." "Their implied surrender," I said dryly. "What did he say?" "Something about now Solidar would pay deeply, and in its heart, for the treachery of its agreement with the demons of Canaan. That sort of thing," Ferran snorted. "They're unhappy we didn't declare war on Canaan over their killings of our envoy's staff members." I suggested. Then they could have had an excuse to invade and grab land. Submissive treaties are a less expensive way for the Council to get cheaper raw materials. The Abieritan Assembly is debating a declaration of neutrality, or they were last week, offered Isola. If war breaks out, that would deny us use of the ports in the Abierto Isles for recoaling and resupply, wouldn't it? If they pass such a measure, Ferran replied. But I'd judge that they're stalling to keep Ferran from declaring war on them while they wait to see what we'll do. That seemed more likely to me, but I concentrated on the corn flat cakes and sausage and syrup, along with the mug of hot tea that I'd poured. Does Ferran have that large a navy? Asked Isola. Only ours is larger, and not by much, but our ships are newer and better. They have a larger army and more troop transports. If we didn't stop them on the high seas, they could certainly overrun the Isles. I didn't pretend to understand the hostility of the Ferrans, especially since both Ferran and Solidar tended to emphasize freedom of commerce, and neither was controlled by a hereditary ruler, despot, or oligarchy in the way lands like Jariola, Canaan, or Tiampre were. My own experiences with the late and less than honorable Clausewell Valar suggested that they were every bit as ruthless as the Collegium was reputed to be. I just listened as Isola and Ferran talked. After breakfast, I hurried north along the west side of the quadrangle toward the large oblong gray granite building that held workrooms of various sizes, as well as some of the specialized manufacturing chambers, all lead-lined so that one imager's work didn't affect another's, the same reason why we all had separate quarters with lead-lined walls and leaded glass windows, because imagers' dreams and thoughtless desires could have most unfortunate consequences, as I well knew. After I'd become an imager tertius, Master de Charton had arranged for one of the smallest workrooms with northern light to be turned into a portraiture studio, and one of my additional duties, as possible, was to paint the portraits of senior imagers. I'd only just completed the first, that of Master Poincaré, not only the head of the Collegium, but also a maitre d'esprit, one of but two, the other being Master de Charton. Master Poincaré was supposed to come by the studio to see it some time after 8th class. He hadn't seen the finished version, and I was more than a bit nervous about showing it to him. Because I reached my workroom studio with a good quarter glass to spare, I spent the time sketching an alternative design for the portrait of Celiora. While the convention was to paint most portraits, especially of women, in a sitting position, I had decided to do Celiora standing. I'd seen the miniature that Emanus had done of his unacknowledged daughter, Madame Junai de Chendal, and that had been done with her standing, and it had a power that a sitting portrait seldom possessed. Absently, I still wondered exactly what the connection had been between Valar and Madame de Chendal. They hadn't been lovers. Political allies, perhaps, since Valar had represented Ferran, which opposed all blood-based hereditary nobility, such as the high holders of Solidar or the oligarchy of Jariola, and since Madame de Chendal had been writing and pressing for a council of Solidar with at least some councillors being directly elected rather than being appointed by their guilds or associations, or by a vote among high holders. Just as the first bells of 8th class began to chime from the Anomen Tower, Master Poincaré stepped through the open studio door. "Good morning, Rhenn." "Good morning, sir." Master Poincaré frowned ever so slightly, an expression that lent severity to a lined and squarish face, softened but a touch by a chin that was slightly pointed and rounded. Under jet-black hair and heavy eyebrows, also jet-black, his pale gray eyes took in everything, as always. He wore exactly the same gray garb as did every imager, with the addition of a small silver four-pointed star circled in silver and worn high on the left breast of his waistcoat, seemingly identical to the one Master de Charton had given me the day before. "Do I want to see the final version of the portrait?" I would hope so, sir. But it's not framed, and that will improve the setting. Is it that unflattering? His words were offered with a smile. No, sir, but since it's your portrait, in the end, you're the one who has to judge. He laughed. You flatter me, Rhenn. In the end, the artist is always the judge, for the portrait always outlasts the person painted. He walked over to the easel and studied the image. It's accurate and not too unflattering. It's a good work. He paused. You didn't sign it, Rhenn. Not fully. According to the Portraiteurist Guild, only paintings which are commissioned and sold through the guild can be signed, so I just used my initials, R.D.I. That seemed the best compromise. Since it's acceptable, I'll arrange with the cabinet makers to get it framed. Master Poincaré nodded. Whom do you think you should paint next? The person I really wanted to paint next was Celiora, but I'd have to work out how to pay for the paints and supplies for that, since the Collegium had equipped the studio fully. But I didn't want to bring that up with Master de Charton. Not yet, anyway. I hadn't thought about that, sir, but shouldn't it be Master de Charton, Master Roland, or Master Julian? Those would be good choices, but of the three I would suggest Master Roland, for a number of reasons. I will discuss it with others. Whoever it is will be here next Samedi. After Master Poincaré left, I worked more on the design for Celiora's portrait, and then tried a rough sketch of Master Roland from memory, setting him in the council chamber at the chateau, standing below the upper dais where the High Council sat. Ferran and I were the only masters at lunch, unsurprisingly on a sunny Samedi, since there were perhaps 1.5 score of maîtres d'aspect across all of Solidar, only a handful of maîtres de structure, and just 2 masters d'esprit. At present, the Collegium had no maître d'image, and there had been but a handful of imagers that accomplished in the entire history of the Collegium. Most of the masters were married, and seldom took meals in the dining hall, except the noon meal during the week, or when they had duties that kept them near the quadrangle. Afterward, I reread sections of the patroller procedures for a while in the study of my personal chambers. I had mixed feelings about the evening ahead. I knew I'd be glad to be with Celiora, but I couldn't say that I was totally looking forward to a dinner with my parents and 2 other couples who were their friends. I walked across the Bridge of Hopes at just before 4th glass, glancing down at the lower-than-usual gray waters of the River Alus. I was holding full imager shields, as I'd had to do for months now, although I had doubts that High Holder Rael would resort to something as direct as assassination, not after he'd had Taudi's chef Artatst garroted for attempting to have me assassinated. Still, matters couldn't have gotten any better either, not since the High Holder's daughter had asked me to dance at the Council's harvest ball, and flaunted the fact before her younger brother, the heir to his father. Once across the bridge I looked for a flower seller, but I didn't see one. Then no one had taken the place of the woman who had been shot when the Ferran had tried to kill me. In a strange way, I missed her and her faded green and yellow umbrella. Before I had stood at the corner of East River Road and the Boulevard d'Imagers all that long, I saw the familiar brass-trimmed brown coach that belonged to my parents. Charleston spotted me at close to the same time, and eased the coach over to the curb, just in front of the west end of the narrow gardens that flanked the boulevard, behind the low stone wall at the edge of the sidewalk. "Master Renthil?" He nodded. "Charleston, thank you for picking me up." Although Charleston had never said a word, I had the feeling that he was as pleased as my mother had been about my becoming an imager master. "You're most welcome, sir. Nordesta design." I nodded, trying not to smile too broadly, then climbed into the coach. Normally, I'd have used a hack to pick up Celiora, but when Mother discovered that, she'd insisted that the family coachman pick both of us up, declaring that it was unseemly that a master imager arrive in a coach for hire. Unseemly anyway, if certain guests might be there. From the east side of the Bridge of Hopes, the drive took only about a third of a glass before Charleston brought the coach to a halt before the north entrance of Modesitt Design on Hago Lane. That was the private family entrance, with gray stone steps up to a small square and pillared-covered porch that shielded a stone archway and a polished oak door. Modesitt Design was manufactory, crafting hall, home, all in one to Celiora's family. The yellow brick building with its gray cornerstones rose 3 stories. All the casements and wooden trim, even the wood of the loading docks at the south end, were stained with a brown oil. I clambered out and looked up. "If you'd just wait, Charleston, she's usually ready." "Yes, sir." I continued to carry full shields all the way to the door, but I didn't have a chance to even lift the brass knocker before Bennett, Celiora's young cousin, opened the door.
"Master Rhenn," he grinned at me. "She's already waiting."
"Thank you, Bennett. Lead on." I followed him up the stairs toward the second level, which held the more public rooms of the 2 living levels, the second and third levels of the building, since the ground floor level was given over to workrooms and power loom spaces. The carved balustrades and shimmering brass fixtures emphasized the elegance of the staircase, which opened at the top into an entry more than 8 yards wide and 10 deep. The walls were paneled in light golden oak from carved baseboards to ceiling. Only a yard or so of the intricate parquet floor was visible, largely covered as it was by a deep maroon carpet, with a border of intertwined golden chains and brilliant green leafy vines. An assortment of various chairs and settees were upholstered in the fabric designs that I now knew had been largely designed by Celiora and her mother. A pianoforte dominated the far end of the hall. Celiora stood at the front edge of the carpet, wearing a crimson dress trimmed in black velvet, with a filmy and shimmering black jacket and a matching black scarf. With her black eyes and jet-black hair, the effect was stunning. And not just to me, I discovered over the past year. If I could somehow capture that in the portrait. She smiled, and for a moment all I could do was look. Then I stepped forward and embraced her, gently, not wanting to disarrange her, at least not before dealing with my parents and their guests. I did get a warm kiss. "Oh, you look wonderful," I murmured. "As always."
If you had the chance, you'd tell all the women that."
"Only if they looked so good as you, and that wouldn't ever happen." Celiora shook her head. I offered my arm, and we walked down the steps and outside toward the coach. I extended my shields to cover her. Charleston kept his eyes on Celiora from the time we walked out the door until I helped her into the coach. So did young Bennett, closing the door only after we were both settled into the coach. Once the coach was moving, Celiora turned to me.
"Are there other guests besides the Ferdinands and the Veblen's?"
"Not that I know." I grinned. "What did Grandmamma D'Estra find out about them?" Celiora offered a sheepish grin.
"Ferdinand not only has his own brick kilns, but he has arrangements with other brick and stone manufactories across Soledar. That wouldn't work except for the ironway, you know." She pointed out. "I was thinking about that when we toured the textile manufactories last summer, just how much things have changed in the last century."
Steam engines and turbines had changed the world, in some ways, but not in others. "What did she find out about Veblen?" I was interested to know, because Veblen was a newer acquaintance of my father, newer meaning in the last 10 years. Father had mentioned that he had started by buying lots of ruined cottons.
"First, he's the son of a former ruined high-holder who killed himself with an antique dueling pistol about 15 years ago. Grandmamma said that was too good for him, and that he made high-holder Rael look like Roland the Unnamer. Veblen used what remained of his share of the family fortune to build a paper mill that uses hemp and rags and Some sort of clay, I think. And now he's...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?